All right, this is the histology and function of the skin from Big Picture Anatomy. So remember that if we go back to our 21-day embryo, the outer tube or parietal part of the embryo has got two layers, the outer ectodermal layer and the underlying mesodermal layer, which of course in the embryo we have always depicted as blue and red. And if we then trace what happens to these layers in the adult, we're going to see that the outer ectodermal layer becomes principally the epidermal or outer layer of the skin, which I've shown here. This is like we've cut through the outer layer now, that the layer of skin in the adult. We're looking at it as if we've cut down through it, so like a cross section through the skin. And we can see that the ectodermal layer becomes the thin cellular layer of the epidermis, overlying and underlying from the mesodermal layer in the embryo, connective tissue layer called the dermis, which is full of collagen fibers and provides structural support for the skin. Now, if we take a closer look at the epidermis, which I've expanded out here, we can see it's a very complicated kind of epithelial tissue. Remember, an epithelial tissue is a layer of cells, a sheet of cells, but in this case, it's multiple layers of cells, and we've created just a little sort of three-dimensional square swatch of skin that we've cut through. And maybe the best way to understand that is the eventual sort of goal of all of these layers is to create an outer layer of dead, flattened skin cells, squashed flat. So it's like you're looking down them from on top, and there are multiple layers of these, and they're called squamous cells. So this whole thing is called a striated squamous epithelium because you have striations, lots of layers or strata, and then the outer layer is squashed flat. And what we find in this outer layer are these dead skin cells that are filled with keratin. These are constantly being sloughed off of your body. They are, in fact, in a well-sealed house, what creates a lot of the house dust from the occupants of the house because of how frequently we slough these off, which means we need to constantly replace them, which is what the underlying layer is about, starting at a basal layer that's constantly undergoing mitosis. However, this outer layer has some very unique characteristics. The cells are filled with a protein called keratin that provides a little bit of structural support or kind of hardness or toughness to the outer layer of your skin. There's also lipids that are secreted and infiltrate around the cells, sort of creating what's called a cornified, structurally tough outer envelope, and provide some waterproofing because those lipids are going to repel the water. Okay, so these cells are filled with keratin. They have lipids between them. There are multiple layers of them, and they are constantly being replaced from the cells underneath. This outer layer of cells is called the stratum corneum, referring to that cornified layer. If we just under it is a stratum granulosum, which are cells that have started to fill with keratin, and the keratin looks kind of grainy. It's usually just about one cell layer thick, and so that's why it's called the stratum granulosum. Under that is the stratum spinosum, where the cells are actively producing the keratin to create the outer layer. And what's also happening, and this is very unusual, is that these cells are making tons and tons of DNA, not to undergo mitosis, but to fill the cell with DNA. And so not only is there keratin in these outer cells, there is also a large amount of DNA that has no information use whatsoever, but is just protective because the UV rays from the sun will hit that DNA and be absorbed by it rather than damaging the DNA in the underlying cells, in the living cells, where it can, in fact, cause damage. Finally, the bottom layer is called the stratum basale, referring to what is usually about one cell layer thick stratum of basal or stem cells that are actively undergoing mitosis, as I've indicated here. So these cells are what we call stem cells or basal cells that undergo mitosis and fill in constantly into the stratum spinosum, gradually move through to the top, fill in more with keratin in the stratum granulosum, and eventually become the dead outer cells that are constantly sloughed off. So these are some of the most mitotically active cells in our body, the underlying basal stratum basale of your skin. Now, in addition to the protection of the DNA, we have another role, another kind of cell that helps to protect the skin from the harmful, damaging, potential damage of UV rays from the ultraviolet rays from the sun, and that are these melanocytes that produce a dark pigment called melanin. I've indicated them in black. They're located in the stratum basale as well, but they're distinctly different cells. And that melanin moves into the stratum spinosum, into the living cells, and it often forms a little melanin umbrella right on top of the nucleus, as I've indicated there, that melanin umbrella to protect the delicate DNA that can be damaged and caused to have mutations in the cells from the UV rays of the sun. These melanocytes have yet another function, which is that they are a processing site to change cholesterol into vitamin D. This does require ultraviolet light coming in through the outer layer of the skin. And so we do need UV light to have this happen. And so there's kind of a trade-off here between how much UV light is available, depending where we live, from the equator up to the higher latitudes of the Earth, and even depending how high up in the mountains you are, and how much sun you're getting. And the trade-off results in different levels of melanin to either protect the nucleus when there's a lot of sunlight available at equatorial latitudes, or to let more melanin in, to let more light in to allow the cells to produce vitamin D from the cholesterol. This historically, as people migrated around the globe, resulted in many different kinds of skin color around the world. In today's world, as we are much more in the city, very often inside buildings, we are able to adapt to these different light conditions, and of course people of different skin color now live at latitudes all over the world. Okay, that's what the epidermis looks like. Remember that whole epidermis, as I've indicated here, if we take a look sort of deeper down into the skin, is sitting on, so now I've kind of reduced all of these layers of epidermis to just a little thin layer here because it's sitting on a much thicker layer of dermis. The dermis is effectively a much simpler tissue to understand. It's a connective tissue. It gives the leathery structure to your skin, and that really provides a lot of structural support for covering your body and holding it in place. And it's mostly collagen fibers. Lots and lots of collagen fibers with these little fibrocyte cells that produce the fibers. There are, however, some parts of the epidermis that dive down into the dermis, from the epidermis, diving into the dermis, especially the hair follicles, which take all of the layers that produce the cornified, outer, tough, keratinized layer of the skin, drag them down into the dermis in the form of a hair follicle, and now push out a different kind of keratin, a hard keratin structure in the form of a hair that emerges onto the surface of the skin. Depending where you are on the body, there might be different concentrations of hair follicles. Hair follicles also tend to have little sebaceous glands that secrete sebum, another kind of oily substance that we've indicated in yellow here. Remember, fats are all in oil, in yellow, that covers the hairs as they emerge onto your skin. Finally, there are also sweat glands that are epidermal cells that have come down into the dermis and differentiated into cells that produce sweat, which also, of course, to help with thermal regulation or to secrete sweat onto the surface of the skin. So that's kind of the dermis. Finally, in both the dermis and the epidermis, we have an immune function because we want to be able to separate the inside of the body or protect the inside of the body from any potential invaders. On the outer surface of the epidermis, we have an entire community of symbiotic or helpful bacteria. There are actually thousands of different kinds of bacteria. They tend to fill in so other harmful bacteria cannot really get a foothold and protect that outer layer of skin from that kind of harmful bacterial invasion. If some harmful bacteria do happen to get through, we then find in the underlying layers of the epidermis these Langerhans cells or immune cells. And those, not Langerhans cells, but other kinds of immune cells would also be in throughout, as is true in any of connective tissues distributed throughout the dermis. So, in summary, remember that ectoderm and mesoderm of the embryo, if in the adult, become the epidermis, the outer layer of the skin. That's the main thing that the ectoderm becomes. And the dermis of the skin, the mesoderm, also forms more underlying muscles and bones and many other things. The epidermis also forms the neural tube down the middle of the embryo and lots of nerves, but this is the main structural thing that is formed from the ectoderm. The ectoderm has this very complicated stratified squamous epithelium with multiple layers, basal cells undergoing mitotic division in the basal stratum basale to form keratinocytes that get filled with keratin in the stratum spinosum, also convert cholesterol into vitamin D, eventually fill with granules of keratin in the stratum granulosum and become dead keratin-filled cells on the surface that are constantly being sloughed off with that fat and protein cornified envelope forming a sort of tougher outer layer of your epidermis. The dermis itself is a much thicker connective tissue forming the leathery structure of the skin, mostly collagen fibers with those fibrocytes throughout it, but also those epidermal structures that dive down, forming the hair follicle, the sebaceous glands next to the hair follicle, and the sweat glands that secrete sweat. That then is the histology and function of the skin from big picture anatomy.